Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the persecuted church in our continuing study of church history. Tertullian, in his Apology, that's a statement of why we believe the way we do, said, "Kill us, torture us, condemn us, grind us to dust. Your injustice is the proof that we are innocent. The more we are hewn down by you, the more numerous do we become. The blood of Christians is seed." That is, the more you poured out the blood of Jesus, the more things would grow, in particular the church. Jesus told of the same thing in John chapter 15, verse 20. He said, "Remember the word that I said to you, a slave is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word," that is, if they kept it, not to obey it, but if they tried to keep it down, if they tried to tackle it, if they tried to keep it in that way, "they will also keep yours also." Paul says the same thing in 2 Timothy 3:10 through 12. He says, "Now you followed my teaching, conduct, purpose, faith, patience, love, perseverance," but also notice verse 11, "persecutions and sufferings, such as happened to me at Antioch, at Iconium, and at Lystra." Remember, Paul at one point was even stoned and left for dead. He says, you followed my persecutions and sufferings at those places. What persecutions I endured, and out of them all the Lord rescued me. Indeed, all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. So it is not a bizarre or rare thing that Paul was persecuted, but rather that is the normative principle for Christians. They should expect persecution. Now, the earliest persecutions in the New Testament were at the hands of Jewish authorities. Now, that's not Jews against other people. That's Jews against Jews, Jews against other Jews, because the Christian church at its outset was entirely Jewish. So all of this was taking place within the realm of Jewish people. So some of the reasons for the Jewish persecutions: they looked at Jesus and they looked at the disciples, and they thought of them as blaspheming. After all, they were speaking of Jesus in terms that should have been, in their minds at least, that should have been only described of God himself. And the disciples did that. They spoke of Jesus in God terms. That's an emphasis of who they believed Jesus to be. They perceived it as a charge of blasphemy. They had a real problem with the cross. The idea of a crucified Messiah was foreign to them, even though the Old Testament had given some veiled prophecies about one who was pierced for us. They looked upon me whose hands and feet were pierced. Yet that was a stumbling block to them. There was also a jealousy among the leaders of the Jews for the popularity of the people. This new Christianity was so popular, it had so many adherents, so many followers, that the Jews just couldn't take that. If it had only been a handful in an upper room, that was one thing, but it was far too popular for their tastes. It's interesting to note in Acts chapter 5 that in the midst of one of these persecutions, some of the disciples had been arrested and they were being questioned by the various authorities. And one of the highly respected Jewish rabbis, we know him not only from the Bible but also from Jewish sources, named Gamaliel. And he gets up and he gives a rather reasoned defense. In a sense, it's of Christians and Christianity. He says, we've seen false messiahs before, and we've seen false teachers come and go, and they're here for a bit. They're like a flash in the pan, and then they're gone. But it might, and if what these Christians are doing is of the same nature, then they'll be here today and gone tomorrow. But it might be that what they are saying is really of God. And if it really is of God, then we will be found to be fighting against God. And so maybe we ought to take care. Maybe we ought to rethink. And it's not that Gamaliel was becoming a Christian, but he's saying maybe they're right. And if they are right, that changes everything. Of course, the Jews, his fellow Jews, did not take his advice. Instead of letting the Christians alone, they proceed to beat him up and tell him, don't say those things anymore. And it doesn't stop. Initially, these Jewish persecutions are limited to Judea and the surrounding regions. Remember Saul of Tarsus, he's going to go up to Damascus to extend those persecutions up to the Jewish areas, the Jewish, neighborhoods and peoples that are living in and around Damascus. And on the way, he is struck down by Jesus himself. He has an encounter with Jesus, and he becomes a strong supporter of the Jesus way. In Acts chapter 8, just before the conversion of Saul of Tarsus, or the one we know as Paul, Stephen, one of the early church deacons, is put to death. We read that on that day a great persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. The church had been growing by leaps and bounds. First, there had been 3,000 on the first day, and then 5,000 men a bit later were counted, and the church was continuing to grow bigger and bigger, and all of a sudden the persecution breaks out, and suddenly the next Sunday there are just the apostles. The church membership has gone down to 12, and everyone else is scattered. But what that has done, that now scatters the church, and it doesn't destroy the church. It just means the church now is scattered, so it begins to grow in other areas. The initial Jewish persecutions do not involve capital punishment. That means that the stoning of Stephen was a illegal activity. It did not have the sanction of government. Capital punishment was initially unauthorized by Rome. Now that's eventually going to change, but not immediately. Christianity, though, comes eventually into conflict against Rome, and it is a conflict of cultures. The Roman schools taught pagan religions, and that meant that if you were a Christian, you didn't want to be a part of that. Roman cemeteries offered up prayers to false gods. If you walk through a Roman cemetery, not only will you see images depicting false idol worship and things like that, but they have these prayers to false gods and false idols. Roman marketplaces sold food that had been offered to Roman gods. The Roman military personnel were required to swear oaths of allegiance to the emperor, and that involved worshiping him. So all of these things meant that a Christian had a difficult time interacting with the culture of Rome. Tertullian, one of the early church fathers, said that attendance at the Roman circus, now when we say Roman circus, don't think clowns and trapeze artists, but rather think in terms of the Roman chariot races. And he said that attendance at either the Roman circus, the chariot races, or the theater was the equivalent to sacrificing to false gods. So he said those sporting events are just off limits for a Christian. That meant that there was a tension between what the Romans viewed as their own religious tolerance. They thought of themselves as rather tolerant of other religions. You could worship any way you want as long as you also worshipped the Roman emperor, as long as you put some sacrifice on the altar, some incense on the altar, offering a sacrifice to him. And that was in contrast to Christianity's exclusive claims. They said that Jesus is not just a way, but they said he is the only way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through him. Now we're in our timeline of church history. We're still dealing with the ancient church. Eventually we'll get to the medieval and then the Reformed church. And the persecutions take place during the first part of the ancient church. They will come to an end by the early 300s. So we have the persecutions not initially beginning except among the Jews, but then once they do begin, they will eventually transfer over to the Romans involved in those persecutions as well. The first Roman persecution breaks out under Nero. There had been a great fire in Rome in the year 64 AD. Nero was thought to have been involved in it. Now, most accounts have him out of town when it began, but he got to Rome, and the fire was still burning, and the story goes that the rumors broke out, just like fire had broken out. The rumors broke out that he had gone up to his palace and that he had gotten his lyre. He fancied himself something of a musician. And he began singing songs about the burning of Troy. And people began to wonder, did he actually start the fire? He certainly benefited from it. He's going to use it to expand his palaces and things like that. And so he needs a scapegoat, and he chooses the Christians to be that scapegoat, and they are charged with the formal charge of atheism. Now that's rather odd, because Christians believe in God, but they are charged with atheism because when you go into their place of worship, whether that's a house church or a place where they are gathered, they have no visible God there. There's no statue of their God. There's no idol. And so they were charged, you don't have a God, and they were charged with being atheists. And Nero involved all sorts of different forms of torture. He crucified some. He had them torn apart by animals. He had them burned to death to serve as lights for his garden party. He had them dragged to death. Tacitus is not friendly toward Christians. He says they were clad in the hides of beasts and torn to death by dogs. Others were crucified. Others set on fire to illuminate the night when daylight failed. I guess the ancient equivalent of a street lamp. The persecutions seem to die down after Nero, but they rise up again, according to Tertullian in his Apology. He's writing after the fact, telling some history, and he says Domitian, this is at the end of the 1st century, Domitian too, a man of Nero's type and cruelty, tried his hand at persecution, but as he had something of the human in him, he soon put an end to what he had began, even restoring again those whom he had banished. So Tertullian's persecution, not as intense as Nero's. We read more about banishing than we do about putting people to death. And notice that between Nero, you'd had the year of the 4 emperors, and then you had Vespasian and Titus, the father and brother of Domitian. And we don't read about any persecutions during that period. Of course, other things are taking place. For example, Jerusalem's being destroyed, but then Domitian is stated to be the next persecutor. We have a series of letters between a emperor who follows a bit later, Trajan, who becomes emperor in 98 AD, and he is writing letters from his governor Pliny the Younger, who's governor of Pontus and Bithynia, located in the western part of what we call Turkey today. And there are letters going back and forth between Pliny and Trajan. In these letters, he says, and this is Pliny's letter to Trajan, meanwhile, in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians, I have observed the following procedure. Here's what Pliny did. He says, I interrogated these as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second and a third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered executed. So if you are a Christian and you continue to be a Christian, even though you're threatened, then you are put to death. This is Pliny's official action against the Christians. On the other hand, those who denied that they were or had been Christians when they invoked the gods in words dictated by me, offered prayer with incense and wine to your image, the image of the emperor, which I had ordered to be brought for this purpose, together with statues of the gods, and moreover cursed Christ, none of which those who are really Christians, it is said, can be forced to do. These I thought should be discharged, and they were let go. So if you were arrested and you offered incense to the emperor and cursed Christ, then you were set free. Trajan sends a reply, and he says they are not to be sought out. In other words, don't go Christian hunting. But if they are denounced, if somebody accuses someone of being a Christian and they are proved guilty, they are to be punished with this reservation that whoever denies that he's a Christian and really proves it, that is by worshiping our gods, even though he was under suspicion, he can be released. That's fine. And so being a Christian under Trajan is punishable by death if you refuse to recant. Now, Trajan is followed by Hadrian. History knows these guys as the 5 good emperors. I'm not sure how good they were. Hadrian adds a little caveat. He says those bringing false witnesses against Christians were themselves to be punished, which probably diminished the amount of charges against the Christians. But being a Christian is still illegal. It's also under Hadrian, he makes plans to build a temple to Jupiter in Jerusalem. Now, it wasn't completed. That brought about what they called the Bar Kokhba revolt, where the Jews revolted against Hadrian in one final revolt, like they had done in 70 AD. They do it again in 133 AD. And this revolt is very harshly put down, and as a result, Jews are excluded and kept out of the city of Jerusalem. They're forbidden entry into the city of Jerusalem for the next 400 years. In fact, it will not be until the coming of Islam and the Muslims that they are allowed back into the city of Jerusalem. I want to talk a minute about Polycarp. He was the bishop of Smyrna, modern-day city of Izmir, but back then they called it Smyrna. He was the overseer of that city, a very elderly man in his 80s, and he was arrested in his house. The soldiers had come to arrest him, and he and his wife were just sitting down to dinner, and they invited the soldiers, why don't you come in and eat with us? Why should this food go to waste? And then we'll go with you, and we'll see what takes place. He's taken before the Roman proconsul. Now, a Roman proconsul is as high as an office as you can hold without being the emperor, without being one of the consuls, and what we would call the president. So he's taken before the Roman proconsul, and he's ordered to say, look, just say away with all those atheists. And remember, they called Christians atheists. And he turns to the pagans, not to the Christians. He turns to the pagans and he says, away with you atheists. And he's not trying to fool anyone. He's saying, you guys are the real atheists. And they are livid. They are angry at him for this. And the proconsul says, well, look, you're an elderly man. Why don't you just, you just go along with us, just, offer some incense upon the altar to the emperor. You can just say these words against your Messiah. And Polycarp replies, 86 years have I been his servant, and he has done me no wrong. How then can I blaspheme my king who saved me? And he refuses to recant. He holds on to Jesus, and he is burned at the stake. We're told that it was the Sabbath day, and the Jews, who normally would refrain from any work, from even picking up sticks, they labor to gather the wood and put it together on the pyre to help put this Christian leader to death, have him burned at the stake. Another story that's told in early church tradition is the story of Felicitas and Perpetua. Perpetua was a servant, and she served her master Felicitas, two women. Felicitas was a young Christian mother, had a newborn child, and Perpetua was her slave. And they were both arrested for being Christians. They're in the city of Carthage in North Africa, and she refuses to apostatize. Her father, who is an important political figure, comes and says, please, will you just do this for me or do it for your child? And she refuses to leave Jesus, and it's this wonderful picture of this master and slave who go together to their death. They are torn apart by animals, and they hold on to Jesus all the way to the end. The next persecution we want to speak at, and we're just looking at some of the highlights, or maybe we could call them the low points. Decius is one of the persecutors, one of the more intense persecutors of the church, coming to the throne in 249 AD. His predecessor, Philip the Arabian, had been so friendly toward Christianity that some have wondered if Philip was not actually himself a secret Christian. We don't have any record that he was, but he was friends with some of the church leaders, and they spoke to him openly of Jesus and of Christianity. Decius, on the other hand, comes on the scene, having put Philip to death, and he is against everyone who's a former friend of Philip, including the Christians. And so he wants to return Rome to her pagan roots. He wants to say, let's go back to the good old days of all being pagans, because Christianity had made far too many inroads in his day. When a plague broke out, the Christians were blamed for it. If anything bad happened, the Christians were blamed for it. All citizens under Decius were required to offer incense with an oath that said Jesus is Lord, and you would therefore either offer the incense, and when you did that, you would be given a little, we'd call it an identity card, that said you were identified as one who had partaken in the oath. And certainly there were those that under persecution of death that denied Christ and obtained one of the cards. There were others who did not offer incense, did not do that, but they found ways to forge the cards or maybe get a friend do it for them and get it, which the more spiritual Christians said, well, we really shouldn't have done that. You should have just suffered for the name of Jesus. The next major persecutor, and notice we're doing a big gap, next to Diocletian in 284. Now, the persecution doesn't begin when he comes to the throne. He is one who the story goes, he rose from slavery through the ranks of the Roman army to become emperor. And as he comes on the scene, he says, the Roman Empire is so big, one man can't handle it. So he appoints 3 co-regents to rule alongside him. What he has, he's the emperor, and he's going to be the emperor in the east. He will have another emperor in the west. And each of these emperors, he and the one in the west, will each have a sub-emperor. We're going to call them a Caesar, and they're going to be sort of an emperor in training. And then at an appointed time, then Diocletian and his other major emperor in the west will both retire, and these sub-emperors will come up to be the new emperors, and they will appoint other Caesars after them. And it's supposed to be a perpetual form of government that he is trying to establish to replace the advancement by assassination that so often was taking place all throughout that century. He initially tolerates all religious groups, including Christians. Christians have house churches. They even have church buildings under Diocletian. But then one of his sub-emperors influences him to raise up a persecution against the Christians. In 303, he does this. He institutes a persecution against Christianity, and he does it with a vengeance. This is a thoroughgoing, harsh persecution designed to stamp out Christianity. Churches are destroyed. Properties are confiscated, which, remember, means that they had building churches and they had properties, and these are taken away from them. All copies of the Bible are ordered to be destroyed. Now, this brings up the question, what is considered to be the Bible? The Jews are still allowed to hold their scriptures, their what we call the Old Testament, but the New Testament books are going to be destroyed. And that's going to bring up the question, Matthew, Mark, Luke, how about the Gospel according to Thomas? What about these other writings of Christians? Which ones are considered Bible? The civil rights of Christians are suspended under Diocletian's persecution. Christians in public office are deposed. And food in the marketplaces are now going to be sprinkled deliberately with wine that has been sacrificed to idols, so that he's thinking, I'm going to starve out those Christians. They will neither be able to buy or sell or eat, and one way or another, we're going to stamp out Christianity. That continues right up to the time of Constantine, the Roman emperor, and I'm speaking about the big statue, not the handsome fellow at the bottom of the picture. Constantine the Great is going to issue an edict of toleration that will allow everyone to worship freely however they wish. And Constantine himself will be a self-confessed Christian. So our period of the Roman persecutions, it begins in the 60s. Notice our timeline going from, I did it in increments of 50, but from 60 all the way to the early 300s with the coming of Constantine. During that period, we've already talked about Pliny the Younger, his persecutions. We've talked about some of those early Christians that were put to death, like Polycarp, like Justin, who has the nickname Martyr, so we call him Justin Martyr. Marcus Aurelius was one who, while not persecuting Christians, he's trying to do it in a more intellectual way. He's writing treatises against Christians, trying to get people to abandon Christ in that way. In 251, we had Decius, one of the great persecutors of the church, and he's followed a bit later by Diocletian, also seeking to stamp out Christianity. And finally, Constantine comes on the scene and puts an end to the persecutions because he himself is going to declare himself to be a Christian. Now, what were the results of the persecutions? First of all, the church was purified. No one was going to be a casual Christian. You were either for Christ or you were against Christ. There was nothing middle of the road. If you were middle of the road, you got out of the church. Secondly, the New Testament was recognized because of the statement, you cannot own a copy of the Bible. That brought up the question, what is the Bible? Am I willing to die for the book of, I use the example of the Gospel according to Thomas, as I was willing to die for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? So the New Testament will be recognized as a result. Thirdly, God is glorified. There's one story told of a number of Christians who were taken out onto a frozen lake in the middle of winter in Gaul, modern-day France, and they are freezing to death. All their clothes have been removed. They're standing out in the middle of the lake. They're singing hymns to the Lord as they freeze to death, and they've been told, if you will just come in and deny Christ, you can come to the fire, you can be warmed up, your life can be saved. And finally, one of the Christians leaves that group, and he says, that's it, I can't do it anymore, and I'm going to deny Christ. And he comes and does that by the fire. And one of the soldiers who was looking on, the story goes, touched at the great faith of the Christians and at how God has been glorified, takes off his own uniform, and he goes out there with the other Christians, and he says, I want to be a Christian too, and I want to die with you. And he does so.